What if the most dangerous part of this war is not the bombs falling on Iran, but the chain reaction now spreading far beyond the battlefield? Because that is what this is starting to look like. The White House sold this campaign as a decisive operation, a forceful strike meant to crush a gathering threat, restore deterrence, and end the danger before it grew into something even worse. The language was absolute. The message was simple. Strength now, stability later. Hit hard, hit fast, and the region would fall back into line. But wars almost never stay inside the story told at the beginning. Now, even as Washington insists the operation is working, the signals coming out of the region are pointing in a darker direction. The United States is moving more military assets into the area. Shipping through one of the most critical energy choke points on Earth is under growing strain. Oil has surged above the psychological threshold that governments and markets fear for a reason. Insurance, logistics, freight, fuel, and food costs all start to feel the pressure when that line is crossed. And in one of the most uncomfortable twists of all, the same administration that framed this conflict as a demonstration of strategic control is now being pushed into emergency measures just to soften the economic shocks spreading from it. That is the contradiction at the center of this story. Officially, this is a campaign of dominance. In reality, it may be turning into a test of endurance, cost, and strategic blowback. Iran does not need to win a conventional showdown with the United States to make this war painful. It only needs to keep the region unstable enough, the sea lanes dangerous enough, and the energy market nervous enough for the costs to multiply. And once that happens, this stops being a story about missiles and military maps. It becomes a story about inflation, alliances, tanker routes, food prices, election pressure, and whether the most powerful country in the world has just stepped into a trap that does not look like defeat at first, but feels like it everywhere else. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back to how this was sold. When Operation Epic Fury was announced, it was framed not as the start of a drawn-out regional war, but as a controlled display of overwhelming force. The idea was familiar. Strike before the threat matures. Destroy the infrastructure of escalation. Break the confidence of the adversary. Reassure allies. Rebuild deterrence. End the problem before the problem expands. In that story, speed was everything. Precision was everything. Resolve was everything. The administration presented the campaign as something that would impose order through strength, not create a new spiral. President Trump repeatedly projected that the conflict would be short, manageable, and effective. The tone was not caution, it was certainty. And that certainty mattered because the public always hears two wars at once. There is the war on the ground, with its drones, missiles, air defenses, and troop movements. But there is also the political war at home, where leaders are not just moving forces, they are selling meaning. They are defining what the war is supposed to be, before the real consequences have fully arrived. That is where the first cracks now appear. If this campaign were truly approaching a clean strategic conclusion, why is Washington acting like it may need more time, more force, and more insulation against fallout? Why are more U.S. military resources being pushed into the region? Why are emergency economic conversations suddenly becoming part of the picture? Why do markets look less like they are pricing in victory and more like they are pricing in disruption? Because the first major development in this story is the collapse of the idea that this would remain short, neat, and contained. The additional deployment of thousands of Marines and more naval assets does not automatically mean America is trapped in a long war. That would be too simplistic, and at this stage, too strong a claim. But it does mean something important. It means the Pentagon is not behaving like an institution that believes the danger is already fading. It is behaving like an institution preparing for a messier phase. That matters because actions reveal risk assessments more clearly than speeches do. Governments can describe a battlefield as stabilizing, while privately preparing for escalation. They can say deterrence is being restored, while quietly reinforcing the very positions that would become targets in a wider confrontation. They can claim momentum while preparing for attrition. And attrition is exactly where a weaker regional actor can still create strategic pain. Iran does not need to dominate American forces to complicate American strategy. It does not need to knock out a carrier group to shake the global system. It does not even need to sustain a clean military advantage for long. What it needs is something far more achievable: the ability to keep enough uncertainty alive in enough places for enough time that the war's secondary effects begin to matter more than its opening headlines. That leads to the second development, and this may be the most important one of all. The battlefield is no longer just in Iran. It is in the Strait of Hormuz. It is in insurance pricing. It is in tanker schedules. It is in commodity markets. It is in every government now asking how much longer this volatility can be absorbed before it turns into something political. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a narrow waterway on a map. It is one of the world's great pressure points, a place where geography can suddenly overpower strategy. When traffic there becomes uncertain, the problem is not only whether ships can pass, the problem is whether they can pass predictably, cheaply, and under conditions that financial markets consider normal. Once that normality is shaken, the consequences spread quickly. Oil moving above $100 a barrel is not just a scary number on television. It is a transmission mechanism. It moves through transport costs, agricultural inputs, industrial production, airline pricing, freight contracts, and consumer psychology. It hits countries differently, but it hits almost everyone. The shock does not need to stay at that level forever to do damage. It only needs to stay there long enough to remind the system how vulnerable it still is. And this is where the official story begins to lose its hold. Because the White House can point to targets struck, capabilities degraded, and strength displayed. But what if the real strategic contest is no longer about what was destroyed in the first wave? What if it is about how much instability Iran can export without having to win anything that resembles a conventional victory? That is the hidden shift. Iran may be weaker in raw military terms, but it still appears capable of shaping the price of risk. And in a global system built on supply chains, financial confidence, and narrow energy margins, the price of risk can become a weapon. This is why wars in the 21st century so often stop making sense when judged only by battlefield metrics. A country can lose infrastructure and still impose costs. A regime can absorb punishment and still make its enemies pay. A military campaign can succeed tactically while failing economically, politically, or diplomatically. The official scorecard may say one thing, the strategic bill says another. And now comes the third development, the one that may be politically the most damaging for Washington, because it exposes the war's contradictions with brutal clarity. To cushion the shock in oil markets, the United States has moved toward temporary relief measures involving Russian oil already at sea. Think about what that says. One geopolitical front is being escalated in the name of security and control, while another front must be partially relaxed to reduce the economic damage caused by that escalation. That does not mean Washington has abandoned its broader posture. It does not mean strategy has collapsed into incoherence overnight. But it does suggest something extremely uncomfortable. The global energy system is so tight, and the consequences of conflict in the Gulf are so serious, that America's war planning cannot be separated from emergency adjustments elsewhere. And that is a devastating image for any administration trying to project command. Because this was supposed to be the demonstration of control. Instead, it is beginning to look like a situation where every move generates another compensating move, and every show of force creates a fresh vulnerability that must be managed in another theater. This is how strategic blowback works. It does not always arrive as an obvious military failure. Sometimes it arrives as contradiction. Sometimes it arrives as political improvisation. Sometimes it arrives as the quiet admission that the world is more connected and more fragile than the opening rhetoric allowed. And that wider fragility is where the real chessboard emerges. Start with Europe. European governments are already carrying the burden of long-term commitments tied to Ukraine, defense spending, energy diversification, and domestic political fatigue. A renewed energy shock from the Gulf is not just another foreign policy headache. It is a multiplier. It threatens inflation management, industrial competitiveness, public patience, and the credibility of leaders who promised that the worst energy disruptions were behind them. Then look east. China does not need to celebrate this crisis openly to benefit from the way it stretches American attention. Every new Middle Eastern emergency complicates Washington's strategic concentration. Every increase in oil instability reshapes trade balances, procurement decisions, and diplomatic leverage. Beijing watches all of this through the lens of long competition. It sees how quickly U.S. bandwidth can be consumed by overlapping crises. It sees how regional turmoil can widen the space for patient maneuver. Now look at the Gulf states themselves. These governments have spent years trying to balance security dependence, economic ambition, and hedging behavior. They want protection, but not regional combustion. They want access, investment, and stability, not a permanent war zone surrounding their infrastructure and shipping lanes. The longer this confrontation runs, the more they are forced into impossible calculations. How close can they stand to Washington without becoming deeper targets? How much distance can they create without weakening the very deterrence they still rely on? That is how a local conflict becomes a systemic one. Not because every country joins the war directly, but because every country starts recalculating around it. And here is the point many headlines still understate. Recalculation is itself destabilizing. Markets recalculate, allies recalculate, insurers recalculate, shipping companies recalculate, central banks recalculate, political strategists recalculate. Once enough actors start making defensive adjustments at the same time, the world does not wait for formal declarations. It moves. That is why this war already matters to ordinary people far from Iran, far from Israel, and far from Washington. Because ordinary people do not experience geopolitical conflict as a map. They experience it as cost. They experience it as pressure. They experience it as one more increase that arrives before the last one was absorbed. Higher oil prices do not stay in the energy sector. They move outward. Trucking costs rise. Agricultural inputs become more expensive. Food distribution feels the strain. Airlines pass on the pain. Manufacturers absorb it or cut elsewhere. Families see it at the pump first, then in groceries, then in monthly bills, then in the vague but unmistakable feeling that the economy is becoming harder to live inside. And governments know this. That is why domestic mitigation measures start appearing so quickly when energy shocks hit. Not because leaders suddenly become generous, but because they understand that geopolitical instability becomes political instability the moment it enters household budgets. For working families, this war is not an abstract debate about deterrence theory. It is a question of whether the cost of everything that moves begins to climb again. For farmers, it is a question of fuel, transport, and input prices. For small businesses, it is a question of margins. For importers, it is a question of timing and uncertainty. For voters, it becomes a question that cuts deeper every week. Why are we being told this is under control if life keeps getting more expensive? That question can become poisonous in a democracy. Because once people start believing that leaders are not leveling with them about the scale of the consequences, the political damage expands beyond the war itself. Trust erodes. Patience erodes. The room for error erodes. And then every additional incident in the Gulf, every new price spike, every military reinforcement becomes not just a headline, but evidence in a growing case that the real costs were hidden at the start. This is why the next phase matters so much. From here, there are really two broad paths. The first is an uneasy de-escalation. In that scenario, Washington continues to project strength, but quietly limits the scope of further action. Iran, damaged but calculating, avoids the kind of dramatic move that would force a much larger American response. Shipping remains tense, but gradually stabilizes under heavier protection and better coordination. Oil stays elevated for a time, then begins to retreat as panic gives way to managed risk. Both sides claim they achieved their aims. Both sides tell their domestic audiences a version of victory. The crisis does not disappear, but it stops short of becoming a wider economic emergency. That is the best realistic outcome from here. Not peace, not resolution, just containment. But the second path is far darker, and it may be more plausible than many officials want to admit. In that scenario, the logic of escalation keeps feeding itself. More disruptions hit shipping. More fears build around critical export infrastructure. more retaliatory pressure mounts. The United States, having already committed prestige and force, finds it harder to step back without appearing weak. Iran, having every reason to shift the conflict into areas of maximum leverage, keeps testing where pain can be created without crossing the one line that would guarantee total war. This is how spirals begin. Not always through one giant event, but through an accumulation of smaller shocks that make restraint politically harder and miscalculation more likely. A ship incident here, a strike there, a warning ignored, a market overreaction, a military redeployment interpreted as preparation for something larger. Then suddenly, the conflict is no longer being shaped by deliberate strategy. It is being driven by momentum, pride, fear, and the refusal of each side to absorb the appearance of backing down. And if that happens, the real danger is not just more destruction in the Middle East. It is the merger of regional war with global economic stress. That combination is always uglier than policymakers think it will be. Because once war and inflation start feeding each other, governments lose room. They lose room to reassure, room to subsidize, room to negotiate, room to prioritize. Every problem begins to crowd every other problem. Domestic politics hardens. Alliance tensions sharpen. Opponents test boundaries elsewhere. Markets stop giving the benefit of the doubt. And then a campaign that began as a show of strength becomes something else entirely. Proof that power can still strike, but no longer control what follows. That may be the deepest lesson buried inside this crisis. The modern world is so connected that even the strongest states cannot easily isolate the consequences of their own military decisions. You can choose the target, you cannot fully choose the ripple effects. You can launch the operation, you cannot command the market to stay calm. You can degrade your enemy's capabilities. You cannot guarantee that your allies, your consumers, your supply chains, and your political system will absorb the secondary consequences without strain. That does not mean force is never necessary. It does not mean every military operation is doomed to backfire. But it does mean the old fantasy of clean coercion is becoming harder and harder to sustain. And that is why this story is bigger than a single exchange of strikes. It is about whether the United States and its allies have entered a phase of geopolitics where tactical victories keep producing strategic messes. It is about whether adversaries with fewer conventional advantages are learning to weaponize interdependence more effectively than great powers can manage it. It is about whether energy choke points, shipping lanes, and market psychology have become as decisive as air superiority and missile defense. Most of all, it is about the difference between what leaders say a war is doing and what the world starts to feel it doing. Right now, the official story says this campaign is restoring order through strength. But the emerging reality suggests something more dangerous. It suggests that this war may be exposing how fragile that order already was. It suggests that America can still hit hard, but that every strike now risks opening another front in prices, logistics, alliances, and credibility. It suggests that Iran, even under enormous pressure, may still possess one terrible strategic advantage: the ability to make almost everyone else pay for prolonged instability. If that is true, then this is not a clean demonstration of deterrence. It is a warning. A warning that the age of controlled escalation may be ending. A warning that great powers can still unleash force, but can no longer confidently contain its consequences. A warning that the next phase of this war may be decided less by who looks strongest on television and more by who can endure the spreading costs of uncertainty. And that leaves us with three questions that should haunt every capital watching this unfold. If this campaign is truly succeeding, why is Washington already preparing for deeper military and economic fallout? If Iran cannot win directly, is it now trying to win through disruption, cost, and strategic exhaustion? And if a war launched in the name of restoring order ends up driving oil shocks, shipping chaos, and emergency policy reversals, then who is really controlling events now?